Did you share on the Zoom?
What? What do you do? How do I work this? Oh, you want me to talk? No, I'm not talking about anything to do with science. What, they want me to keep talking? Well, yeah, Jamie, you gotta listen, man. I demand attention here.
His job is over because he selected you.
He selected me? Oh.
Okay, you good.
Oh, okay.
Carpenter. Oh, there we go.
Can you see it online?
Okay. Yep, it's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, I gotta hit that one? Okay, so I got this word, and I have to confess, I'm actually was really honored and touched to actually get this award, and I'd like to thank first of all Linda and Gurchan and Harpinder for nominating me for this award. It means something in many ways, but also in the extent that when I did retire, it was kind of during COVID. I came back for a retirement party at our wheat meetings. And they were going to acknowledge me there, and I ended up missing that because of a flight back from New Zealand being late. So I missed my retirement party there. And then my partner had arranged in our lab at the University of Alberta for a retirement party for me there. And I had been working in the summer volunteering in the Caribbean. And I came back with COVID and didn't get to have my retirement party at the university. So I took this in some ways as sort of a way to say thank you, I guess, to a career that I've had in science and in agriculture. All I wanted to do, I was given a letter saying I had received this award as a distinguished agronomist, which means I'm old. And I've been telling people that I got an award for being old. And I just thought that I'd just say thank you to the many people in the plant science world who have been important to my career, and just say thank you to all those people, because what I've come away with from 45 odd years of working in agriculture, 43 years working in agriculture in the form of plant breeding and scientific work, I guess, as a professor, I came away with a gratitude for the people I've worked with, and the realization that I don't, and nobody works alone in this field, and that I am deeply grateful for that human experience. And so here's my reality. These are some varieties that we've bred over the years. There's Jake, a variety named after my grandfather, Jacob Spanner. That's his gravestone in Edmonton. He walked out of Eastern Europe at the age of 13 as a refugee and came to Canada. And so I named a variety after him. The variety up on the top is called Go Early. And that's now, I've thought, a way to say an homage to the past recipient of this award, Pierre Huckel, because that's actually a cross between a variety that Pierre developed. It's not as good as Pierre's variety, but it's a lot earlier, which was my mandate. But Pierre was a great mentor of mine, not by saying many words, but by being an incredible plant breeder and by leading by example. And one of the things that he said to me, to sort of highlight what I'm going to say a wee little bit about science, is that it's not really that science is, I think after a career of science, you realize how little the contributions you make over the years. And Pierre one time said to me, because I did a bunch of selections in a heavy drought year, and the stuff that I selected the next year was way too tall and shitty, and it all fell over. The only lines that did good in drought. And I said, Pierre, what do I do? How do you select in drought? Because I remember Pierre saying one time, you make your best advances in bad years in plant breeding. Mm-hmm. And he just said, why don't you grow stuff in a disease nursery under irrigation, go measure the height there and cull on height there. That's, in my mind, great science, but it's actually just a really simple thing. So I also did a lot of work, I guess, and I'm saying I right now, but I'm going to change that very shortly, a lot of work in quantitative genetics. Here's one of the papers that we had in quantitative genetics on the effect of the height-reducing gene. And here we proved, using all the fancy DNA markers that you get in the modern world, that the green revolution works. That short height-reducing genes mean that you get great yields and do great work in high input environments, but when you put that back into an organic environment, it doesn't work so well. So that's using all sorts of fancy science, 90K SNPs and all this sort of stuff of the modern world, and I could go through my career and say how we started in RFLPs, or we started in dial-Ls, and then we did RFLPs, and then we did whatever, DART markers, and then SNP markers, whatever. But in fact, at the end of the day, we still don't know an awful lot about genetics. And there's still so much to learn, and we're still tinkering around the edges. And I would say in this very short talk about science is that we've all just been tinkering around the edges of the green revolution. And we're all just, everybody in this room, we're still tinkering around the edges of the green revolution. And we think that we're all scientific, and I've taught in classes about Leipzig finding out the macronutrients, the German soil scientist, finding the macronutrients to feed a crop. And we found that those are nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, etc. And Leipzig found that we need that to grow crops. But for 2,000 years in the Hispaniola, we've been growing crops with a fish underneath it, so we knew we needed nitrogen and potassium. We just found ways to label that. And so we've just been finding ways to label things in terms of agriculture and things like that. And you see this graph, and I think one thing that's interesting to me when I took a graph, this actually comes from my PhD, where the Green Revolution was all the inputs and everything put on, and it all starts at 1960. And I was born in 1959. So we're saying the Green Revolution is really for my lifetime, and how we've increased yields, but we've also increased an awful lot of problems in the world, and those are the problems that we now have to continue to work on, because the hurricane that just went through the Caribbean is a direct result of all those pests, all those nitrogen crops that we're doing at the expense of energy and spewing greenhouse gases into the environment. And I would say this graph showing that this is the world population and we need all this nitrogen to feed that world population. Well, really? When I spent last summer in the Caribbean, where the temperature of the ocean never went below 28 degrees now. And so that hurricane that just spewed up in the Caribbean, and there's gonna be many more to come, are because that ocean has become so hot. And we all know why. So just briefly then, I just want to now go into saying a few thank yous for my career. I'm going to speak as a plant breeder. Here's my pedigree, and you can see that there's a lot of universities involved in my pedigree. And so that's basically been my home for 45 years. University of Alberta that I dropped out of and then became a professor. The one university that isn't there is my mom, who actually taught me when we were living in Nigeria as a child, and probably was able to focus my very, very ADHD mind and be able to teach me on my own and help me very much at that time, and it was formative. But in addition to that, of course, I went and worked at University of Guelph. I've been a student at Laval, York. I taught school in Eastern Africa, McGill, University of the West Indies in Trinidad, University of British Columbia I worked at, and I've been an adjunct at Memorial, Manitoba. And for the last 9 years, I've actually taught a course in France on plant breeding. And here's my breeding value. It's very, very done. I guess I'm old and I'm retired. And so there's the accomplishments. I feel that you're listening to say here's why you get an award. But one thing I pointed out in so doing and putting this up there, because I'm not really one to talk about achievements, but all those papers are co-written by students, by other scientists within the Agriculture Canada community, within the world community, of which I've all been really grateful for. And there's been no paper that I've ever written on my own. I've always been a minor contributor to that. In addition, as a plant breeder, I've developed a few varieties. A plant breeder doesn't work alone. And I've always been annoyed as an academic, you know, our big grants are the National Sciences and Engineering Research Council Awards. I need some water. I used to teach a course in communication and science where I would tell people how to give talks, and I'm breaking all my rules right now. One of them was drink water. Anyway, all of these things were done in association with other people. And when I apply for a grant, for an NSERC grant from the Government of Canada, I say, I do this, I'm planning on doing this research, I'm planning on breeding in low input environments, I'm going to do that. And then all the money goes to the student who's actually doing the work. And so actually the greatest joy I've had as a professor, and even as a scientist, is the people that I've worked with that have gone on for careers. And I see a few of them in this room. I went out for dinner with 2 people at this table who are now working in science. There are a few people scattered around the room who I've been involved with in student activities as well. And for them, to see them go on has been one of the great joys of an academic career. And you know, teaching courses, you're involved with all these students. They're incredibly enriching to a person's life. Similarly, you know, I'm credited with being the sole supervisor of 40-odd PhD and MSc students. Oh, that's screwed up. But really, there was a committee involved. Nobody does any work in plant breeding, and nobody can pretend that they know everything about what's going on in plant breeding. I'm shitty in biotechnology and stuff like that. I hated working in a lab. I did that for a year. And what I want to say then is the breeding value is only as productive as the environment. And as geneticists, we all know, especially as a quantitative geneticist, that the environment's a hell of a lot more important than the genetics. And we still don't know very much about genetics. But I do want to acknowledge the people that I've been involved with. Here's where I live now. This is a brief little graph of places around the world. That's where I worked for many years and was born into. These are some of the places where I've worked at for more than a year, various scientific places. I've taught for 15-odd years courses in Europe, and I've done various projects in various parts of the tropical world. But I'll just start by saying thanks to my mom and dad. There they are just before I was born. Those are my 2 brothers, and 2 of the reasons why I'm in agriculture, because they're doctors, real doctors. My other sister's a doctor. My other sister's a lawyer. So I came up, and I'll just explain briefly, there in the top corner are my father and his 2 brothers, and that one in the middle is my Uncle Sid. My father was the only one of those war pictures who served active duty in Europe for 4 years on a tank after D-Day. But my other uncles, there's actually a museum I saw in Winnipeg of prairie sailors. The uncle on the left was a prairie sailor who, in the Second World War, ran the boats between Europe and England, between here and England. But my uncle in the middle there was the first member of my family, my lineage, who ever went to university. And my father was the second. And so we were all under very great pressure to go to school. Unfortunately, my parents brought me to this hell-forsaken part of the world. You see in the left bottom corner, that's taken flying back into Edmonton one winter from New Zealand. But my father's midlife crisis was taking us as a child to Nigeria during the Biafran War. And it was there that my mom taught me. My dad taught at this school, the Elisha Grammar School in Nigeria. But out our back door was a jungle, was the tropical rainforest. And it was there that I was really interested in the natural world and was really interested in all the animals and plants and stuff like that. There was a professor at the University of Guelph later on who said that coniferous trees still photosynthesize in the middle of winter in -40, or they still transpire their water because of the way xylem and phloem are made. And I remember being so blown away and found that professor inspiring me so much about plants and how interesting plants were and how they could work at that temperature, that's how I became interested in agriculture in that way. But this was probably a more formative experience in agriculture, and that I worked in that orchard that's in the top corner there. That's on a collective called Kibbutz Merchavia in Israel that I went to after I dropped out of the University of Alberta when I was 18, I think, or 17. And I went and worked a year of my life in that orchard. That's Golda Meir, the third prime minister, the only female prime minister of the Middle East at that time. She comes from that kibbutz as well. And there's a picture of it in its modern incarnation. And you can see the hill in the background is the Nazarethan Hills, or I think where some people would know that Jesus was born. But I spent a year of my life picking grapefruit in that orchard, and that really inspired me to work in agriculture later on. To the point that that picture in the bottom corner is actually when the war broke out in October 7th of 2023, I went to Israel in January and February as a volunteer for the food bank there, and was picking fruit there as well. But when I came back from Israel, my mother had disowned me because I hadn't gone to university, and I had dropped out of university, but I got a job. I came back and I started working at the University of Guelph, but for 2 summers I worked at the University of Alberta for a man named Dr. Zenon Kondra. And Zenon Kondra, unbeknownst to probably the University of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, was one of the co-founders of canola. So the University of Alberta was actually a very important part in the development of canola. That wasn't done by this Professor Zen, who retired. And that's my point in talking about mentorship. That was done by, there was a refugee from, the Vietnam boat people, An Vo. An Vo developed it, she was a little tiny scientist, and she had developed a technique of pinpricking to take out some of the particles of canola before DNA work, taking out some of the particles in the canola seed so that you could test for the glucosinolate and erucic acid without damaging the seed. And in that way, they were able to select for double lows with double low glucosinolate and erucic acid within canola, and develop the first canolas in the world, the first double lows. And that was done not by the bigwigs like Stephenson and Zen, who putatively paid my salary, but by the technician Delbert, who ran the field program and who was also actually taught the course that I ended up teaching for 20 years. He taught the course, and he also ran the program. When Zen retired with the profits of the first canolas and went off into the foothills of Alberta and lived just like, who wrote that song, Four Strong Winds? Not Taylor Swift. Who wrote Four Strong Winds?
Tyson.
Ian Tyson went off into the foothills, and so did Zen. His wife had a farm in the foothills, and he went off there with the profits. But the technician Delbert in the far left right corner of that picture, Delbert ran the program as the field technician for probably 20 years. You know, the other guy came in and developed high Q canola, which was blackleg resistant canola. What was his name? Not Ian Tyson, no, oh my God, the precursor, no, not Keith Downey. He was there before Habibur, just before. Gary, what was his last name? Stringham, yes. Gary Stringham ran the program. He crossed into a what kind of line? It was from India. He found blackleg resistance in India and crossed into a mustard. and developed black resistance, made $2 million, is still the program that made the most money for the university as a privatized program, was that particular program based on a simple cross with blackleg resistance to Indian germplasm. But I then went to work at the University of Guelph for a man named Wally Beversdorf. How much time do I have? Am I going?
I took
5
a class
10
from
minutes?
that guy.
Okay. Wally noticed that when you put triazine on the ground, it stays in the soil. It's a perfect environment for developing resistance. Found mustards that were resistant to the triazine herbicides that were used in corn, crossed that mustard into canola, developed triazine-resistant canola, which never yielded very much because the resistance was in the chloroplast genes. But he made a fortune because the biotech companies noticed what he was doing. We tried to develop Roundup Ready, and we did develop Roundup Ready just in microspore culture, putting Roundup into microspore, but that didn't have a gene that was patentable. So there's the story of science there. Wally then took that and transferred that into a 20-year career as a CEO of Ciba-Geigy, various chemical companies, and lived in Basel. There he is with the chair of the department, Peter Pauls, I remember, was there at the same time that I was at the University of Guelph. I just started along with Pierre Huckel at that time, and that's Van Raj Khan, I believe, an important member of this society. One of the things that Wally did for me that was really important for my early career was he just let me, because I think I taught a course for him that he liked. But what that did was allow me to work for a year and go traveling for a year, and which really helped me, not in the terms of science, but in the terms of understanding the world, I guess, a little bit. One of my jobs was teaching agriculture in Central Africa, in Kenya, along Lake Victoria, at this particular school, which taught me a fair bit about agriculture and the importance of agriculture, but also the interface of science, I guess, with other things. Again, another person that's really important to my career, Dr. Diane Mather, who was a professor, I believe the predecessor of this young man over there. She was my supervisor for both my master's, PhD, and postdoctoral fellow. And while she might not have been a great field reader, she was an extraordinary editor of scientific papers and taught me an awful lot about writing and taught me an awful lot about biotechnology, not to the extent that I understood, but she was very, very good in terms of supervising people and helping people and understanding laboratory. And she was the lead of the North American Barley Genome Mapping Project. So at the very beginning of that revolution that we're all still doing, and I still saw a few talks where people are talking about QTL and stuff like that, and I see that there. And while I was with Diane, my PhD was actually, I worked for 2 years for the Canadian International Development Agency in Trinidad, and my real supervisor on the ground was the man in the bottom there, Dr. Richard Brathwaite, who was an agronomist who worked up and down the Caribbean. And he was my supervisor, and one of his great skills, and I'm still friends with many of these people or communicate with them. Richard is just an extraordinary wealth of knowledge on how things grow. And he would go up and down from his position as a professor and lecturer, first of all, and a professor at the University of the West Indies, working and interfacing with growers and farmers all throughout the Caribbean, and just say, no man, you can just grow this stuff, come on, man, grow it. And that's a picture out of a project for my PhD. This is actually one of the great achievements that I would have in my mind, which excludes all the other sort of stuff in the big scientific papers. That's a variety of corn that we developed out of a West Indian landrace, so bringing it back to life, and that's it growing in the Laventil ghetto in Port of Spain, in a really poor part of the world, and that's people growing our variety up in the ghetto, which I thought was really cool. I was looking for pictures then to go through some of the various people that have been super important for me over the years, and that of course includes many, many graduate students who I feel really fortunate to have interacted with. And I think one of the things that I learned at the beginning of my academic career is that graduate students are not really meant to be your students. You're meant to be co-equals. You're co-scientists. And treating them as such and learning from them is a really extraordinary part of the university experience. And so I'll go through, because in this particular picture up at the top, you have at the far left one of my great mentors when I arrived at the University of Alberta, knowing nothing about wheat. And that's Dr. Don Salmon, who died at the age of 58 of alcoholism, but was an incredibly wonderful man in terms of introducing me to the scene and just growing stuff for me and teaching me about wheat breeding in a calm, beautiful manner. Because some of you who know the Alberta scene might know what Alberta agriculture was like, with a few domineering scientists who really were full of themselves. And Don was not. And I'm not saying the name, of course. Next to Don there is the tall man, is Klaus Strenske, who's been my chief technician for over 20 years, and who's still working there. Next to him is Rob Graff, I believe another award recipient of the Canadian this society, who taught me an incredible enthusiasm. Starting at a university is a really hard job, because you're having to teach and you have no background in teaching. Fortunately, I had a little background in teaching because I had taught in Africa and I had taught in various universities. But most people don't have that. And so it's really hard to get going at a university. And when I would go visit in Lethbridge, first of all, Rob Graff, he would just bounce around the field and say, look at this, look at this. And he had this infectious enthusiasm for plant breeding that really was just an extraordinary. Every time I came back from Lethbridge, I would have this enthusiasm for work. Next to him now, we have a whole series of graduate students in my first cohort, Todd Reed, Jerome Bernier, who wrote a paper on drought-resistant QTL in rice. I made the cover of the national newspaper in Bangladesh for that paper. It's the highest cited paper that we've had. And we found, of course, that we found a gene that doubled the yield of rice under drought, and it didn't work when you put it in any other population. So a lesson in genetics, I think, and a lesson in QTLs. And when anyone gives you a talk and says, here's a QTL, here's how you can increase the yield of it, blah, blah. Okay, I only got a few minutes left. Jerome, who else can I see there? Brian Love, Heather Mason, and then Ali Reza Navabi is there. You have a travel award. He was my first postdoc. He died at 52 of pancreatic cancer, unfortunately. But great scientists, all of them. In fact, in that first cohort there, you have, I think, 4 students who were getting the highest scholarships from the Canadian government at the time for over $80,000 tax-free in 2006. So they were actually getting paid more money than me. And then at the bottom is Mohammed Iqbal, who has been with me, and this is actually his graduation party with all the students there. Iqbal has been with me for all those years, and just an extraordinary scientist, really diligent, has come back and forth from Pakistan, and is an extraordinary mentor and scientist for me in a quiet, unassuming way. And the bottom picture I added because I missed in the first cohort Dr. Alison Nelson in the bottom there. I believe down here, Allison, and she works, I think, at I don't know where she works now, but at AAFC somewhere in Manitoba. I noticed one of the papers that they talked about being the best paper of climate science that you had talked about, or the editor had talked about. She was the senior author of that. Another really important person for me, and I say this with all sincerity, is Harpinder, who brought also this incredible enthusiasm in about 2007 when he was hired. And I remember every Sunday, of the last Sunday of January or the first Sunday of February, I would show up at this hotel in Christchurch, New Zealand, and take Harpinder from the hotel and go to the park in Christchurch and try and keep him awake so that he wouldn't jet lag, so that we could go into the field there. And for 3 weeks of every year, I would meet up with him for 15 years in Christchurch, and he would just say shit about Ag Canada. And, what? Oh, that's fine, that's fine. This goes back to your boss man, who I don't particularly like, but I don't work for Ag Canada. 15 Valentine's Day together. Yes, he was my regular date on Valentine's Day, that's true. And then in the summer, we go into the rust nurseries in Creston, and that's pictures at the, I think, Jimmy's Pub in Creston. And so it was an annual cycle of working in fields. Here's another cohort. I had to add the picture in the top corner of Enid, because Enid's sitting right there, who worked with us for many years as a lab person, and then finishing her second PhD from Cuba. She almost finished the first one, but then came there. In the back are two PhDs, one of them running a big Monsanto lab in the States. Over to the left in the field there. And in the center, Dr. Hua Chen, who arrived in Canada. She says, thanks to my wheat group, but arrived in Canada from China, not speaking a word of English, and spent a year smiling and working her ass off till she got back, till she got a PhD and delivered it in English, and just gave an extraordinary presentation over the years. In the bottom, we also now have a technical group. There are students in there from Vietnam, from the Ukraine, over in the corner, etc. From Pakistan. Who's where? There's Isabella. Isabella is right here.
Hiroshi up there.
Hiroshi, yes. I wanted Hiroshi, who is right here, the executive director. Also spent 9 years with me. As a master's and PhD. He's very slow, but anyway. But no, I mean, someone who's really enriched my life. In fact, lived in my house for a year while I was on sabbatical. So I'm, in fact, deeply grateful to all these people. And in there too, Fabiana from Brazil, Isabella in the corner. This is, I don't know if you remember, about 10 years ago, there was a website called Women Smiling, Laughing While Eating Salad. It was before, you know, Twitter and all that shit. But there was a website of just pictures of women smiling while eating salad. It was a rather satirical thing, and so I got them to smile while eating salad there. That's Isa, who has a degree in genetics and a degree in fine arts, and has developed many of the materials for courses I've taught around the world. Here's a subset of a working life at the university. That's what a plant breeder loves. There's a bunch of rust on your plants coming out of the rust field. That's actually a really productive day in the where are we? A real productive day. There's Klaus on the board organizing the 50 to 100 odd field experiments we would run every day. The boxes in the corner of the different setup of seeds and our varieties and the names of them. Now I've memed my niece from Toronto every day, between 5 and 20 memes a day for, God, since phones came in where you could send memes. And so this is how she would help me teaching, sending me memes that I would put into my lectures, you know, of when you cheat on the test, but you still fail. A subtle way of telling them not to cheat. And then, I'm not showing any of the undergrad students over the years, but in the far left corner, I judged the chili cook-off for the agriculture students, where they'd come and make bowls of chili. And there they are dressed up and saying, eat beef, not pig, or something like that, because they found out I don't eat pork or something like that, I forget. And just on another note, in the bottom corner is my first student, Heather. She was in my first undergraduate course. She did a master's and PhD and works now. She worked for Montana State as a professor, but they don't pay enough in the States, so she's now running the research organizations for the organic societies in the United States. And in the top left corner, sadly, an extremely talented statistical genomist, Cassis Semang, and his family, one of whom had just graduated from university, but Cassis got pancreatic cancer as well in November, was diagnosed in November and was dead of March this year. So a bittersweet sort of reality. And here's some slides to end up with. The bottom corner with all the people. For the last 9 years, I've taught a course in northern France near Paris, an Erasmus Mondial program for plant breeding, for international plant breeding, because they don't have plant breeding in public institutions in the States, and all the private companies that need plant breeders realize they don't get plant breeders graduated anymore. And so there's a program in France and Sweden and Turkey and Spain where international students are taught plant breeding, and because many of the teachers now are all in the private world, they don't know much about teaching. And so I've had an open invitation to teach there once every year, where I teach half a course every year for the last 9 years. In the top corner, I volunteered in Dominica this last year. The woman in the top corner I was a climate smart agriculture advisor. She, Shania, also is now the climate smart agriculture advisor there, and she did her master's degree working with Ag Canada and the climate people. I forget exactly where, but it was during COVID. And I just wanted to point out that cohort of the 3 young women there in the right, those are students from that program from 3 or 4 years ago. And to me, that's just a picture of the future. And to me, it makes me very happy to see the smiles on their face, the incredible enthusiasm, the incredible ability of those students that I was teaching at that school. This is simply a picture of the benefits that I've had of a career in academia. This is a farm I bought in central Alberta. It's a place that I consider a refuge, and I'm sad that I'm not there now. And I'd also just like to say thank you to my partner, Anne. This is actually last year. That picture of the group of students was in France this April, where we were teaching. That's Anne in the Giverny Gardens of Claude Monet. Her parents are both artists, and both have died over the last few years, so that was an important thing for me. And at the bottom, we've been attending weddings. The woman who's been sending me memes all those years is with her new husband, Sarah Spanner, and then my 2 brothers, the doctors in the corner, and the remaining parts of my family. Because in moving back to Edmonton, of course, where I had my career, I was moving back to sort of be with my mom and dad, because I had been away from Alberta and my home for 25 odd years, and I was able to be with my father as he died in 2006 and my mother in 2018. So that's the remaining members of our family. That said, one cool thing that happened, that's it for the talk, but one cool thing that happened, I didn't really even know this, but when my grandparents, when they had their bar mitzvahs, when they were 13, they were told to leave, and they walked out of Eastern Europe, and they walked to England, and they got educations, and they met up in Kenora, Ontario, and there was a Spanner General Store in Kenora, Ontario. Then they moved, when the railway was built, they moved east and worked in various places there. I didn't know this, but then their parents came to Canada and died in Winnipeg. So yesterday I went out to the graveyard and laid rocks on my great-grandparents' gravestone. So it was a really cool experience for me. So I'm very grateful to have been invited here, if only for that, but also because it's been a great experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, for the wonderful presentation. For those, Dean did not